So the book entitled The First 5,000 Years by the anthropologist David Graeber, published in 2001, establishes the idea that the debt credit system originated in the Sumer civilization around 3,500 BC. Another way of saying that is it came from the area of Iraq, modern-day Iraq, or ancient Babylon. And there are things in the code of Hammurabi, king in Babylon, to show very strongly that indeed debt credit was developed in ancient Babylon. Now in the Bible, ancient Babylon is the first of 4 kingdoms on the earth. We are in the 4th kingdom, the kingdom of Rome revised, before the 5th kingdom, the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. So in this video, we're exploring the Babylonian debt credit system of economy. So this is the Babylonian Credit Debt System, Part 3, entitled Inflation, the Moth, the Rust, and the Thief. Now Jesus told us these words in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 19. Lay not up for yourself treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break in and steal. Matthew 6:19. So you have the whole idea of moths eating the cloth. They feed on the cloth. And as I grew up, we had a cedar chest in the house, and my mother would put wool items in the cedar chest, and she would put mothballs in there so that no moths would go in and eat the wool. Incidentally, the clothes really stunk after coming out of the cedar chest with the mothballs. Now, rust corrupts a metal. And those of you who live in northern part of the United States and have to fight winters, you know that the snow, the ice, the rain corrupts the metal on the car. And one item for thought when you purchase a car is there any rust on the car, and in particular on the frame? Because the rust ruins the metal. Now, of course, there are thieves who come and steal, and I won't entertain you or bore you with stories about thefts that I've known of in life, but you know of the great potential for anything to be stolen. Now, inflation is a moth, inflation is rust, inflation is a thief. So, how do you know what's going on in terms of inflation? Well, supposedly there's a basket of goods that measures the cost of items over the years, and this basket of goods is a certain price, say in the year 1950, then it's a certain price in the year 1960, a certain price in the year 1970, giving you some idea of how much the cost of those goods and services increased over each decade. Now, I was recently reminded that one of the problems with this is that recently they've changed the basket of goods to items that people don't usually purchase, which means even though they might say the inflation rate was 4%, it might actually be 6%, because the items they're using are items that people don't really consume a lot. They have to be common items that we all share, such as common foods, common housing, common transportation, common health care, that type of thing. So the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, supposedly measures this for us. Again, there's always deception. And Jesus warned about deception many, many times, especially in the 24th chapter of Gospel of Matthew, that deception in the latter part of the end times would be very great. So inflation is like a moth that eats up the dollar. Inflation is like rust. Inflation is like a moth that eats up the dollar, like a moth eats linen. Inflation is like rust because it corrupts the metal and decreases its value. Inflation is like a thief because it steals and takes away purchasing power. Now, I had never really thought about inflation and never thought much about my life and my calling until almost the end of my first pastorate. I was confronted with some reality that I really didn't want to be confronted with. So in the year 1981, inflation was 10.3, 1982, 6.1, and on down the line in my list of what the CPI said inflation was for those years. Now, for example, after my first year, my first pastorate, 1981, when I started, inflation of that year was 10.3. So I needed to, for my 1982 salary, to get a 10.3 raise. Again, this year I needed to get a 6.1, 3.2, 4.3, 3.5, 1.9, 3.7, 4.1, 4.8, 5.4. Now, what was the truth? Some of these years I got no raise. Some of the years maybe I got 1 or 2%. At best 3%. So by the year 1989, I was really borderline poverty. I began a salary of $12,000 a year in 1981. In 1988, my salary was $16,000. Now, down the road from me, there was a smaller church. And by that I mean the attendance was half the attendance of the church I was serving. and they were going to offer a new seminarian right out of school $18,000. And I had been at the church for 8 years, and my salary was $16,000. So there was quite a gap for me, and I was starting to raise a family with children. And I was very bewildered. How could this be? How could this be? That there could be such a gap. And then I did my homework. And I did exactly what I'm showing you here. Except right at this moment, I'm not putting numbers in here for you of the percent raise. But what this chart shows is that each year I needed to receive a raise comparable to inflation. And each year, any raise, if there even was a raise, was nowhere near comparable to inflation. So I was faced with the situation that down the road from me, a congregation half the size of the one I was serving actually offered a a better paying salary for me as a young man with children. Now, I didn't go to the church down the road, but I did leave this church after this year, 1989, and the church was doing well. There was no major conflicts. I was quite content, but I was approaching poverty according to the poverty statistics. So this doesn't just apply to me, it applies to anyone and everyone. And the truth is, unless you get a raise comparable to inflation, you begin to drift backwards towards the poverty line. Once again, let me say it. Unless you get a raise comparable to inflation, you will begin to drift backwards towards the poverty line. And this is why you'll hear articles about the disappearing middle class. The middle class is shrinking. And that is why the middle class is shrinking. This is getting less and less and going more towards this direction. And it is disappearing. Now this upper class grows because it's not really affected too much by the inflation factor, because it has considerable wealth to overpower inflation. But the average individual, unless he or she gets a raise comparable to inflation, is drifting backwards. Now, I did some teaching at university level, college level, and I did this lesson for my class, and I had 2 or 3 students come up to me afterwards and thank me over and over again because they didn't understand why, after many years in a certain job, which was a good job, that they were beginning to feel the economic pinch. So there are many factors that contribute to inflation. I won't get into them. But one of the great factors that contributes to inflation is the role of government. So we need to look at the history of deception that has been done by those who created this Babylonian system of credit debt. Again, it comes from ancient Babylon, and it is not the way that a viable economy should be run. And I'll get into that a little more in the next video. We'll talk about the role of a government. We'll talk about the deceptions that have occurred. We'll talk about the way an economy really needs to function rather than on credit debt system. So I'd like to thank you for watching this video. This concludes the video.